Hello, we're going to look in this PowerPoint at Chapter 11, and this PowerPoint is focusing mostly on intelligence. And this is cognitive development in elementary school, and your textbook actually calls it middle childhood. But often students get that confused with middle school. So in regards to Piaget's concrete operational period, and this is his third stage of cognitive development, children in concrete operations are beginning to be abstract thinkers, but they still have quite a few limitations. They can think more logically, so you can explain things more with elementary school children than you can with infants, toddlers, or preschool children. They can understand the transformation of things, so they can think about, for example, cookies when we were making them, even after they've been baked, where before they could not reverse those thoughts. But they still need real objects and three-dimensional representations of those objects to develop more complex mental representations. So we still need to provide real materials and representations of those materials for elementary school children. And so in concrete operations then, they can think more systematically. They can follow mental sets of rules. And by the way, they can actually follow the rules when you're playing a game with them. Keeping in mind that in concrete operation, that doesn't really start until they're in second grade. And they can successfully accomplish things in 4 domains. They can reverse, and we mentioned that before. They can think more logically and systematically. They can seriate or put things in qualitative order, not just quantitative, but they can think of the quality of things, like big, little, and medium. They can do transitive inference, or they can look at relationships between objects based on the relationship to a third object, sort of like this hierarchical chart that's on the right of this slide. And they really are truly beginning to think abstractly. And so here, when we talk about conservation, remember we watched the video of children not being able to reason beyond what they could see. And so here it shows us the improvement of those conservation skills. And so in this graph, it tells us the percentage of children on the left-hand side, and across the bottom we can see their age. Starting with at the end of kindergarten when they're 6, going up to the end of 3rd grade when they're 9. And you can see the progress of their conservation skills. And so you can see the green line is the conservation of mass. The red line is conservation of volume. So you no longer have to worry about whether a cup is wide and short or tall and skinny. Class inclusion, so being able to classify things, that's the dark blue line. Hierarchical classification is the light blue line. And then conservation of weight is the orange line. So you can see it kind of goes up and down, levels off, and then goes up again. But by 9, they pretty much, almost all of them have accomplished some of those tasks. Okay, so that's Piaget's concrete operational thought stage. Now we're going to look at information processing and the basics of that theory. And we've been talking about attention and memory in infants and toddlers and preschool children. But now let's look at the basics. Now that children from information processing theory have developed more basic skills. And so according to information processing, when we think, there are three things that happen. First, we have to encode. When we get new information, we have to encode it and get that information into our memory. And part of that is, of course, paying attention to it first. We have to be able to store it or retain that information over time so that we can retrieve it later and take that information out of storage. And so remember, we're thinking about this in relationship to computers. We have to type something into a computer or encode it. Then we have to save a file so that we can retain it, and then we have to remember the name of that file so we can retrieve it, get it out of storage, and use it again later. And so by middle childhood or elementary school, all the three types of information improve. So they're able to sustain their attention, they're more able to focus on a particular task for longer periods of time, and again, this increases with age. They can focus on relative information that they need and ignore the irrelevant, and they're better at filtering information. So they're better able to tease out, if they have to answer a question, what they need to answer that question, and ignore information that they don't need. And they're better at executive control or maintaining attention across tasks so that they can deliver desired results and inhibit doing things that are not part of the task. And keep in mind, remember, with information processing, it's not about stages and steps, it's just about increasing skills. And so you can see we talked about these types of attention in early childhood, but now we're talking about how they improve for elementary school children. And so let's talk a bit about sensory memory, which is where we first process memories. And sensory memory is short-term information gained from the outside world utilizing our five senses. So we get it from sight or visual, and by the way, in the United States, we depend on this sense the most. We get it from sound or auditory information, from touch, tactical, or haptic. Those are three different ways we could talk about touch. Taste, which is can be called gustatory, and smell, which is olfactory. And just to bring back that comparison to computers, gathering information from our senses is just like putting information in the computer with the keypad, the keyboard. And so we often are bombarded by a lot of information coming to our senses. For example, when you go to the grocery store or go shopping in the mall, there's always music playing, but we don't always remember what music is playing. And so we're getting that auditory information, but if we don't do anything with that information to process it in some way, we're not going to remember what music was playing. So usually the information that we tend to process in that kind of situation would be something that's unusual. For example, if your parents really liked listening to Frank Sinatra, and all of a sudden you hear a song that's a Frank Sinatra song that you've heard them play as you were growing up as a child, but this time you hear it being sung by a more current singer like maybe Beyonce or Jay-Z. And so if you hear that Frank Sinatra song being sung by one of those two artists, you may be surprised and pay attention to it and listen more closely so that you can tell your parents about hearing that. And so when you do that, you're putting that information that you gained about that song into your working memory, which is a workspace within the mind used to carry out operations, store information, and make decisions on a moment-to-moment basis. You may also sing along with that, and so you're going to add more auditory information, plus you're going to have to use your memory more in order to sing along following that tune, and then you're going to remember it even more when you get home to tell your parents about that song. And so that's a good example of how paying attention and processing the information can help you get it into your memory. So you encode it, and then you have to store it so that you can retrieve it to tell your parents about it. There's also central executive memory, and this is the focus of attention, and it moves the information to long-term memory. So listening to it, singing along, helps move. Listening to it puts it in your sensory memory. Paying attention and singing along puts it in your working memory. And then actually the singing along part moves it to your long-term memory. So information processing theory also says that children's processing speed increases rapidly until they get to adolescence, middle adolescence. They're better able to problem solve and think more complexly. They have longer attention spans, and their memory improves. Also, semantic memory improves, and this is a vast network of associations between ideas that include words as well as themes. And remember, semantics is the meanings of words, and so this is the brain looking for associations, assimilating and accommodating associations of those memories. Consolidation is creating more and more individual concepts. Children develop memory strategies by rehearsing or organizing information, like creating ways, like abbreviations to remember a list of things they have to remember. And then meta-memory begins during this age, and this is thinking, and meta, that prefix means thinking, and so this is thinking about memory or knowledge about memory. And today we're discovering more information about memory so you can think about different kinds of memory, like semantic memory, sensory memory, working memory. Okay, so that now we've talked about the two theories of cognitive development for elementary school. Let's talk about a way that we measure intelligence. And intelligence is really a measure of what you're able to learn. And in 1904, the French government hired a scientist named Binet to develop a test that could help them decide which children in their country could be the most successful in learning complex information to develop skills to work in more complex and sophisticated jobs. And so their hope was this general intelligence would predict the person's ability to learn. And remember we mentioned that Piaget actually helped Binet develop this intelligence test. And then another researcher named William Stern in 1912, he took the ideas that Binet developed and came up with something he called the intelligence quotient. And the quotient is, remember, a quotient is something that you used division to develop. And his quotient is you take the mental age of someone, and the mental age is something we can determine by the individual's ability to answer certain types of intellectual questions. And then we divide that by their chronological age and multiply it by 100, and that gives us their IQ, or intelligence quotient. And so you can see the formula there. Mental age is represented by MA, and then we divide mental age by chronological age, which is a person's age in years and months, and then times it by 100. And so both of these approaches really use a hierarchical model of intelligence that focuses mostly on the individual's verbal abilities, their spatial abilities, and spatial really looks at relationships, and then their numerical abilities. So that intelligence quotient is measured on a standardized scale with a mean of 100, of which just means that that's what the score that the average person might get, or most people who take the test would get, and a standard deviation of 15, which means that there might be a bit of error if you were to take the test at another time or in another format. But they've determined that generally an IQ score remains stable during elementary school and adolescence. But some of the limitations of IQ tests are that they measure school skills, and even though you might do well in school, you may not do well, for example, in social situations, or you might not do well in social situations, but you might do well in school, and so it doesn't really determine overall success in all areas of life. And the scores can fluctuate depending on the situation, how the person's feeling, whether they got enough sleep the night before, if they were feeling well, if the room was too hot or too cold. And IQ tests may not be as valid for individuals who come from homes where there are not as many resources as other individuals might have, like if the family is low income, or that they're in the non-white categories. And so here's some examples of this is from the Wechsler intelligence scale, and Wechsler's IQ tests specialize in measuring intelligence quotients for children. And here's some examples of questions. What does exhale mean when it comes to vocabulary? That would be a vocabulary question. Perceptual reasoning, the child is asked to put these particular blocks together to make this picture. So can they solve that problem using touch and sight and their thoughts? Working memory, I'm going to say some numbers, listen carefully and say them right after me. So a series of 3 numbers. Can they remember those 3 numbers in order? And then processing, speed is the last one. And so is the first symbol in the list, and the examiner shows the child how to mark yes and directs the child through a few practice items. When I say go, do these, pointing to a sheet, the same way as quickly as you can. And so it's just how fast can they process information. And so if we were to give an IQ test to a number of people and put their scores on this graph, generally this normal distribution is what we would see. And so you can see there, and this, by the way, is called a bell curve because it looks like a bell. You can see that if we look in the middle, that's the highest part of the graph, and that's the average score of an IQ is 100. And then this is from the Wechsler test, by the way. And so you can see that blue indicates the range or the standard deviations that we talked about earlier. So between 85 and 115 is considered an average IQ score. Low average, high average. And then we go down lower, and you can see it goes from 85 to 70 on the lower end, and from 70 to 55. And you can see the number of people that fall in that range are much fewer. And then on the high end of the distribution, you can see it goes from 115 to 130, and then from 130 to 145, and then a very small percentage is in the category between 145 and 160. So over time, as we've done IQ tests, we've discovered that this isn't a perfect bell curve in real life. In fact, there are many more people who fall on the higher end of the bell curve that have IQs between 115 and 160. So that's a much higher percentage than there are that fall on the lower end, 85 to 70 and 70 to 55. And so it's not as systematic or logical as this might make it seem. And so when we're looking at intelligence challenges, or those that struggle with everyday life and particularly maybe school and being successful in school, and something we have to keep in mind when we're talking about intellectual challenges too is today when we determine or diagnose intellectually challenging special needs, it's not just about IQ, but it's adapting to life skills as well. So by far, the largest category of those with intellectual challenges fall in the 55 to 70 range, and that's 89% of the people in that area. The next is moderate, and this would be from 40 to 54, and that's 6%. So it goes way down from 89% to 6% in the moderate range. Severe would be 39 to 25, and that's only 4%, and then below 25 is 1%. And so generally the mild area when it comes to school, they're considered educable, and what that means is the individuals should be able to read and be able to calculate and do math, whereas the moderate range is considered in the school achievement area as trainable, so they can do basic, simple kinds of tasks. So when it comes to intelligence or IQ, it's been determined that 50% of the variability in intelligence comes from our genes. But there can be an influence of the environment on those scores. For example, if in an environment a child is not getting enough food, or they're being abused, or there's not enough resources, that could lower their score. Or if a child is in an environment where they have access to lots of resources, for example, if they are able to take dance lessons, music lessons, participate in sports, that might raise their IQ level. So as we mentioned earlier, there are several limitations to the intelligence quotient approach to measuring intelligence. And so Howard Gardner, he came up with an alternative way of where we can measure intelligence. And he says it's not just about the verbal, spatial, and linguistic aspect, but there are really there are a total of 9 kinds of intelligence where we could excel. And so as included in these are the ones that the intelligence quotient does measure, but there are additional ones. For example, visual spatial comes from the regular IQ test or intelligence quotient. There's bodily kinesthetic, so those who have athletic abilities and sports abilities, if they're on a major league team, they can be extremely successful in life, even if they're maybe not high in their scores for visual spatial or logical mathematical. Musical is another way that we could be intelligent. So those that are songwriters or talented musicians, they can also be very successful in life, even if they're not maybe as successful in school. You could have interpersonal intelligence, where you have abilities to work with other people, like be a politician. You may be very successful in doing that, even if you weren't so successful in school. Intrapersonal is someone that can think about spiritual things and things within themselves. So you might be successful as a religious or spiritual leader, like the Pope of the Catholic Church. Linguistic and logical mathematical, those are the 2 other traditional intelligence quotients abilities. Another one of Gardner's additional multiple intelligence areas is naturalistic. You may be very talented and skilled at interaction and interacting with and learning about the natural world around you. Like Ansel Adams, who was an arborist who became very famous. Or you could, the last one is existentialistic, and that's exploring and finding the meaning in life. And so you might be a great philosopher like Socrates or Aristotle. So these are 9 different kinds of intelligence that go beyond what school focuses on. Another scientist that has some ideas about intelligence is Sternberg, and he has a triarchal theory of successful intelligence, and he says there are 3 types. There's analytic intelligence, there's creative intelligence, and there's practical intelligence. So the analytic follows along with Binet and his intelligence quotient. Creative goes more along the lines of Gardner's 9 multiple intelligences, and then practical intelligence would be more focused on social interactions and real life kinds of intelligence.